Hi, everybody. I'm going to tackle today a topic that I might have to use several videos to tackle, which is about craft in the art world. And for many years, I've seen people, you know, uh, gyrating, wanting craft to be included in the art world as a legitimate fine art. And I can see there are many arguments for that. I don't see any reason to differentiate between so-called fine art and painting, sculpture, and what is craft, which often involves painting and sculpture as well. One of the things I did early on was to look up in a wonderful etymological dictionary that I have the origin of the term craft, and it actually comes from, I think, an onomatopoeic word, which is the sound of a hammer striking an anvil, perhaps. Craft, Dutch kracht, power, craft or force, power and energy. And it's formed with, and they put a T on the end of the word craft, crap, which is to draw forcibly together, hence the thing that I'm thinking about, which might be the origin of it. And the funny thing is, the original term was crap, so no wonder people think craft is crap, right? Or at least the royal we has told each other to look at craft as a lesser thing than fine art. In a book, I'll stop the share for a minute so I can show you this book. It's a wonderful book called Born Under Saturn by Rudolph and Margot Whitcoer. Discusses how and why artists were interested in promoting themselves throughout, well, since the Hellenistic period until the Renaissance period, or the post-Renaissance French Revolution period. And what was interesting, they pointed out about, say, 2,000, 3,000 years ago, all visual art was not considered art. It was considered literally hierarchically lower in rank than poetry and music. Back in the day, you didn't have to be literate to be able to paint or sculpt. In fact, they engaged in slavery in those days, and they often had slaves doing painting, frescoing, making frescoes, and assisting in making sculptures. The idea was that you were replicating nature, you weren't getting inspiration from the gods and creating something wholly new. So even something like this that you're looking at would be viewed as not as close to God as, or the gods in that case, as poetry or music. Then, painters didn't like that. Painters wanted to think of themselves as thinking people, feeling people, people who had access to God as well. And like in so many cultures for many, many centuries, and cultures all around the world, all forms of visual art were generally, the reason they even existed was to enhance our access or an appreciation of God and the divine, and gods and the divine, and things other than daily reality. So what's with this idea of taking an eyeball, putting wings on it, and making it out of woven glass beads? Painters fought for centuries to actually be considered legitimate artists and legitimately having something to say, especially after, at least in the Western Europe, painting divorced itself to an extent from ecclesiastical uses. So the big thing for many paintings was to convey an idea and to convey an emotion. And painters made it very clear and worked very hard to convince people that they were getting divine inspiration. And they were also, over the centuries, over the years, they went away from representational to more feeling inspired works. Famously, they deconstructed the way things looked. They stopped wanting to, in the modern era, they stopped wanting to make things that, especially after photography, that you could just look at in a photograph or look at every day. And of course, this artifact is over 100 years old. 1917, this guy decided, okay, I'm going to go into a plumbing store, buy a urinal, write a name on it, and call it art. And even his friends thought that was too rad for them. But in any case, artists, fine art painters and sculptors really fought tooth and nail over the course of centuries to be considered up there, so to speak. And part of the reason, that's actually a purse. The head opens up. I've got to make a brain coin purse for it one of these days. So people really had to, one of the ways they differentiated themselves from the so-called lesser forms, or, to get part of the big boys club of poetry and music, was to differentiate themselves from craft artists, and especially representational artists. This painting right here is a wonderful example of emotion and abstraction. And there's the purse open. Still got to make that brain coin purse. I promise I will one of these days. In the meantime, within the painting world itself, painters established a hierarchy amongst themselves. First, you've got oil painting at the top, then you've got acrylic, then you've got lesser forms such as watercolor and pen and paper, or charcoal. So within fine art painting, just that, genre within a genre, you have hierarchical notions of what's better than others. This painter works in oils, started working, making illustrations for a guy who is justly famous in the car world, Ed Roth, who was a pioneer in the use of fiberglass for a car body, and came up with incredibly great things. He was a very humble man, but he was extremely influential. And this guy started out working for him, making his ad copy and such. He later, this painter's name's Robert Williams. He later was one of the early artists who worked with or contributed to Zap Comics, the underground comics of the late 60s. That was really rad and underground, and got in trouble for obscenity and, broke a lot of boundaries. But this guy, when he was in art school, was derisively termed the illustrator because he didn't want to do emotional abstractions. He wanted to do things where you could look at it and know what it is without a panel explaining it. This is one of my pieces where it's representational, and it's actually inspired by a record album cover. It's called Ecstasy. This Robert Williams paints kind of narratives, mini narratives. And one of the things he's lampooning in this painting is the fact that you just do not use that shade of green if you want to be considered a serious artist. This is something that I've used as an example of people insisting that only oil painting is the only kind of fine art there is, and that aside from sculpture and and that all fine art painting is perfect and perfectly fine and noble and all this stuff, and non-commercial. And there's Thomas Kincaid, who's been called what, catnip for psychopathologists. And of course somebody, I forget who it is, I'll have to look up the name of the artist, who decided to lampoon a Kincaid concoction and do that of his own self, or do his own version of a Kincaid. So really, what happens with, oops, what happens with, excuse me while I get my pooter together here. What happens with, let's say, the way people think of art and craft and handle the terminology and make things real by calling them certain things, and even using tones of voice when they refer to things, is quite arbitrary. Again, go back 3,000 years and you're going to find a whole bunch of people that don't think that even the most beautiful sculptures that we revere and hopefully repatriate to the original countries from which they were taken, were just looked at as, workers. So that's just a little kind of a tidbit intro to this vast subject. I have more fun slides to show you, and hopefully fun takes on the whole idea of art and craft, and art in the craft world. And let's make our craft as tasteful as we possibly can, so we're not looked at as a bunch of sloppy hippies doing pottery or something like that. And how people morph the terminology, how people frame their arguments, frankly, for legitimacy, and how maybe the idea of asking somebody for legitimacy is the quickest way to get a no. At the very least, you have a 50-50 chance of getting a yes or no. Like, can I sit at the big boys table? Answer, it'll be a yes or a no. And the gyrations people go through or try to go through to get a seat at that table. So here's to irreverence and eating at many different tables, and I'll see you next time. Take it easy. Bye.